I receive a lot of emails from students, particularly those interested in genetic counseling. It's always great to connect and when I can provide resources. So I thought I'd let you know of Keck Graduate Institute's summer classes. KGI offers resources for undergrads, including an intro genetics course that explores how the information in DNA contributes to diseases, physical traits, and other inherited characteristics. This is a great way to expose yourself to genetics, test out if you want to pursue a career in the field or fresh on some topics, prep for grad school. So many different reasons to take a summer course. Learn more and browse all of their courses by visiting kgi.edu/DNA Today. Again, that's kgi.edu/DNA Today.
How is it that we find ourselves surrounded by such complexity, such elegance?
The genes of you and me, the genes of you and me, we're all made of DNA. We're all made of the same chemical DNA. We're all made of DNA.
Hello, you're listening to DNA Today, a genetics podcast and radio show. I'm your host, Kira Deneen. DNA Today informs you on what's happening in the genetic world. During my broadcast, I educate you, the public, on genetic and health topics through news and interviews. Guests usually include genetic counselors, researchers, doctors, patient advocates, and biotech leaders. Today's show is a landmark episode number 100, and before I interview my special guest, I wanted to take a moment to sincerely thank all of you listeners, new and old, for tuning in. It's been such a fantastic experience over the last 7 years, going on 8 now, to share news and interviews with you all as I'm learning these topics over the years to introduce them to you as well. And I hope you've enjoyed listening to the shows as much as I've enjoyed recording and interviewing with people and producing the episodes. Now, I should plug this more, but it seems like a good time to ask you guys to rate and review the show on iTunes or whatever podcast player you listen on. Maybe it's Google Play. It's really quick and easy to do, and it does a lot for the show to increase the visibility so other genetics nerds like me and yourself can discover it. So I'd really, really appreciate it, and I think it'd be a great way to kind of give back a little bit for the landmark 100 episodes. So thanks again for sticking with the podcast. I hope you continue to listen, and as always, feel free to write in with ideas and questions to me at info@dnapodcast.com. I really love hearing from your listeners, even if you're saying, hey, I've been listening for a while and enjoy the show. So let's jump into it. I'm very excited to introduce my guest for this episode, Carl Zimmer. He writes the Matter column for the New York Times and has contributed to The Atlantic, National Geographic, Time, and Scientific America. He's won the Stephen Jay Gould Prize, among many others, for his journalism. Zimmer teaches science writing at Yale University. His books include Parasite Rex, Evolution, the Triumph of an Idea, Microcosm, E. coli, and the New Science of Life, and his latest, She Has Her Mother's Laugh, which we're going to be discussing on today's episode. She Has Her Mother's Laugh has been named the 2018 Science Book of the Year by The Guardian and Amazon. It was also included in 2018 book lists on the New York Times, Publisher Weekly, Kirkus Review, Mental Floss, Science Friday, among many other major review sites. So thank you so much, Carl Zimmer, for coming on the show. It's an honor to have you.
My pleasure.
There's so many interesting topics that you talk about in your recent book, She Has Her Mother's Laugh, that have different types of questions that we're going to talk about today and different topics. Highly recommend the book. It's a long read, but it's a really great read.
Glad you like it.
So I want to start out with, what is the earliest history of our understanding and discoveries of hereditary concepts, and how far back does this go in human history?
Well, the way that we think about heredity now, where you envision some kind of invisible microscopic substance that gets passed down from one generation to the next and helps to determine the traits in that next generation. That's actually a pretty recent concept. The word heredity is quite old. In Latin, it's hereditas, but that doesn't refer to heredity the way we talk about it. That refers to the rules about who inherits things. How do you inherit the rights of your parents or somebody else? And so it was more of a legal concept, really. And when people would try to explain why they, looked like their parents or had some similarities to their parents, it was really more of an idea that, well, they're from the same environment, and so the environment sort of shapes your development in the same way. So that's why some people one part of the world are tall or other people in another part of the world are short, is just because they share that same home. And there are certainly a lot of examples of how people harnessed heredity for breeding, for example, but they just wouldn't use the language that we use. I mean, in the 1400s, you start to see references in European history to blood. And so, people talk about inheriting noble blood or common blood, or, and that kind of is similar to what we talk about today with heredity, but it's a slowly emerging concept. And really, as a scientific question, heredity, the way we think about it, doesn't actually emerge until the mid 1800s with Charles Darwin and his cousin, the English scientist Francis Galton. And they both in their writings start to say, well, it really does look like there is something biological going on from generation to generation, and we have to try to figure out what that is.
We've gone from concepts of the environment, which some people think opposite, like nature versus nurture, to slowly switching to more biological concepts. As time is going on, our definition of hereditary changes, as you've talked about. What do you think is included in that definition today?
It's interesting. I mean, I think that, scientists will talk about heredity in certain ways, and the rest of us talk about heredity in sort of overlapping ways. Geneticists study genes because they want to understand these mysterious little stretches of DNA and how they work. And they're also interested in how they get transmitted from one generation down to the next. That's a form of heredity. I would say that when most of us think about heredity, we think about it in a more kind of general sense, that somehow we have inherited not just this gene or that from an ancestor, but more sort of like the spirit of that ancestor, and in the sense of like you're like your ancestors in a sort of very overall sense. And I would say that actually, if you get down to it, genetics only explains that kind of sense of heredity only so far, because a lot of what we are talking about when we talk about heredity in that sense is more like things like culture, for example. That cultural traditions, they do get passed down from one generation to the next for many generations. We use a language that, people a couple hundred years ago would pretty much recognize. Some of the words would be new, but it's still the same language. We have the same values and concepts and so on. So I think that we have to be careful about what we're talking about when we're talking about heredity. And that's sort of that's what I explore in the book, because I think that in the age of genetic testing, where millions upon millions of people are starting to look at their DNA for the first time, I think we're trying to apply all sorts of big values and concerns about heredity onto these little bits of DNA, and they just can't carry the weight. And we have to, heredity is much more complicated and interesting than we assume it is. We have a pretty, I would say that we generally have a pretty simplistic view of heredity, and it's really crucial that we enrich it.
And for those looking at, say, ancestry, like you mentioned, and doing those direct consumer tests like 23andMe and Ancestry, they're looking at a lot of data and they're looking at it from that perspective, but you're opening up a little bit more to say it's not just necessarily the physical genes that are passed down, but all of the cultural values and things. How do you see this changing in the future as we become more involved with this big data, genomics, public health perspective, but also looking at the culture? Do you see the concept changing to focus on the genetics, or do you see it expanding further to include other areas?
Well, I hope it does expand to include other areas, because one of the interesting things that I talk about in the book is that there are other channels of heredity and not just culture. For at least some species, epigenetics, which people may have heard of, looks to be an important kind of heredity. Maybe even the microbiome in some cases is inherited. And so there are actually scientists right now who are developing what they call an extended theory of heredity, to go beyond just the simple notion of heredity equals genes. And so we need to think in terms of that. But even when we think about genes, I mean, I think that there just needs to be a lot more education, broadly speaking, about what it means to inherit genes from our ancestors. And time and again, if somebody gets one of these test results and if there's something on there that about a genetic variant that has something to do with cancer, people think, well, I guess I'm going to die of cancer. And that's just not how genetics works. There are some cases where you can really tie one trait to one genetic variant very clearly. But when you talk about complex diseases like cancer and diabetes and so on, there can be hundreds, even thousands of genes, all of which play a very small role to determine a risk for these diseases. And so to just, to really zero in on just one can be a really big mistake. But it's sort of hard to think about a trait like a disease risk or even something like height as being something you inherit across so many genes. We can see with height, it's a simple trait that I talk about in the book. If your parents are tall, you're probably tall. If your parents are short, you're probably short. It's what scientists call a very heritable trait. But that doesn't mean that there's a simple answer to why that is true, why that connection is there. Actually, height is a very complicated, mysterious process. And it turns out that lots and lots of different genes pitch in to the process to let a person grow to a certain height and then stop. And I think this understanding heredity in this much richer way, it really has to start in grade school or high school, I think, because the last time a lot of people really learn about these things in a deep way. And, if you start with Mendel and stop with Mendel, that's not going to really help you in this new age of DNA.
And with so much genetic news happening, people are starting to, I think, learn more about it in media and going out and learning on their own through different public forums and things. There's a couple different types of inheritance. Can you explain the difference between, say, horizontal and vertical inheritance?
Sure. So vertical inheritance is the kind that we're most familiar with because that's, for the most part, how our own inheritance works. What that means is that if we're talking about genes, for example, they get passed down from parents to offspring and to their offspring and so on. So you can think of it as like a vertical line extending down through time. But for a lot of species, especially microbes, from time to time, it's possible for genes to move horizontally. In other words, from one individual to another individual. And that can be an individual within the same population, the same species, or even different species. You can have flows of genes between species if you're talking about, hybrids, for example, and that happens a lot with animals. But with bacteria, it's much more extreme. What happens with bacteria is that they will actually sometimes build a tube, connect to another microbe, and pump some DNA into the other microbe. Sometimes viruses that infect one microbe will copy their DNA and pick up some of their host microbes, and then when they make new viruses, those new viruses carry along some of those genes to a different microbe. And so you have this shuttle between individuals made possible by viruses. It's a very weird way of thinking about heredity. You could maybe imagine, just shaking somebody's hand and they have blue eyes and you have brown eyes, and then there's a little trait of DNA in that handshake and suddenly you have blue eyes too. It's really important actually to our very survival because bacteria can evolve resistance to antibiotics and then not just pass them down through vertical inheritance, but they can also pass these resistance genes to other bacteria through horizontal gene transfer. And this happens all the time. This can happen. It could be happening inside of your own body right now because there's just a lot of horizontal gene transfer going on among the trillions of bacteria inside your body. It accelerates the spread of these very dangerous genes that can potentially endanger this really important part of medicine.
And many people may not realize that this even occurs. Like they think of parent to offspring, that things are passing down, but this concept that you can pass to other individuals without having another generation in there might surprise some people.
It might indeed, and it has profound implications for how we think about life in general. David Quammen has just written a really wonderful book called The Tangle Tree, and if you think about the tree of life, this was Darwin's big metaphor for the evolution of life. That's based on vertical inheritance, the idea that genes, well, he didn't think about genes, but the idea that heredity was something that connected one generation to the next, to the next, to the next through these lines of descent. And so you'd get a species branching like a tree into new species. And so you have basically this big genealogical tree of all life on Earth descending from a common ancestor. That is still true. And yet at the same time, horizontal gene transfer has drawn connections between those branches so that you sort of start to get this more web-like structure to the history of life.
And even within vertical inheritance, I was surprised to learn in your book that full siblings, so they have the same parents, their DNA is not necessarily 50% the same. This can range a little bit from like 37 to 61. There's such a wide range.
This is definitely one of those fascinating aspects of heredity that we can overlook. And I think we overlook it. We have a struggle to understand it because we're using old ideas about heredity. We really do think about heredity in the language of blood still. You can use the word and people know what you're talking about. Someone will say, when Elizabeth Warren had her DNA tested, there were newspapers that were saying, well, Elizabeth Warren may indeed have Cherokee blood. People will be talking about themselves in terms of, I'm full-blooded Italian and so on. And the thing with talking about blood is that, well, somehow you are getting sort of this even mixture of the blood of your parents, and they got the even mixture of the blood of their parents and so on ad infinitum because, well, you can divide blood into these tiny little drops. And, for a long time in the United States, there was this thing literally called the one drop rule. It was our form of racism in the sense that in some states like Virginia, if you could trace even your ancestry to one person who was African American, who was black, that meant that you were also black. And so this has nothing to do with the heredity of genes as we now know it. And so you're not necessarily the same blend of quote unquote blood. You're this combination, you're inheriting different combinations of genes from your parents. And so the thing is, if you have a brother or sister, and you both are descended from the same parents, well, your parents each are carrying genes from their parents. But exactly which copy of each chromosome, they're your maternal grandparent, father, and your maternal grandmother, which one your mother ends up with inside of one of her eggs, from chromosome to chromosome, that's just a flip of the coin. And along the way, you have this weird thing called meiosis, where you can actually get these chromosome pairs actually shuffling DNA. Basically, the upshot of that is that, your mother might draw more DNA from her mother than her father in order to build the DNA in one of her eggs that goes on to become you. And that might be different for your brother, and so these combinations of DNA, you can compare them now. That's the amazing thing, is that scientists can actually say, okay, let's look at these two siblings. Let's look at all their DNA and let's identify the similar parts and the dissimilar parts. So if you and your brother inherit exactly the same stretch of DNA from your same maternal grandfather, that's going to look totally the same. Now, it's a bell curve. So for the most part, the people will be 50-50, but it's a bell curve, which means that there are actually a whole lot of people who are less than 50% related to their siblings. And there are actually others who are more than 50%. And it could go quite far out on either extremes. If you're looking at somebody who's only 37% genetically identical to their sibling, they're kind of they're more like first cousins. And then on the other side of the spectrum, if you look at a pair of siblings where they're like 60, 65% similar, they're moving towards being more like identical twins. And so, I find that fascinating. And I do wonder, in a big family, I only have one brother. And so it's kind of hard for me to judge. But if you're in a family of 10 and you look at your siblings, I mean, can you tell that you're more genetically similar to some of them than others? I wonder. Because, when you're talking about 10 kids, just a simple law of probability, you are going to be more closely related to some of them than others.
And that's probably why some people are, wow, you look exactly like your grandfather. And maybe if you looked at the genetics, they inherited a lot more from their grandfather than their grandmother on that side. So that would be an interesting study to see if people were looked at to see how closely they look and maybe other things, not just looks, and then look at their DNA. I'm sure that there'll be more information as we progress into it. I also want to know how closely we are related to other family members, including our ancestors. I was surprised to learn that our fourth cousins, we might not share any DNA with them, which just really surprised me.
It is surprising. And again, I think this harkens back to these old ideas of blood. I mean, we have basically tried to substitute blood with genes and think that it's just a simple conversion, and it's not. This process that we've been talking about, where one chromosome in each pair of chromosomes ends up in an egg or in sperm, and meiosis, where you have this shuffling of DNA on the chromosomes. If you repeat this over many generations, something actually kind of weird happens, which is that you can have a situation where the DNA of an ancestor gets smaller and smaller and smaller as a percentage of the DNA that people are inheriting, until you get to a point where you don't share any DNA at all with that ancestor. And in this, likewise, if you trace how the DNA gets passed down from an ancestor down different branches of a family tree, you may find that different pieces of DNA are getting inherited by, one person and their cousin. And something else to bear in mind is that you and your fourth cousin, sure, you share a whatever it is, great grandfather or mother, but that's just one ancestor among a lot of other ancestors that you each have. You only have that one ancestor directly in common, at least in that particular generation. So what that means is that some of that DNA just gets squeezed out along the way, and so that you and your cousin, although you are cousins, share no DNA that you inherited from a common ancestor. And it also means that if you go back in your own ancestry, you get to a point where there's a good chance that any given ancestor gave you no DNA at all. If you go back about 10 generations, it's about half. In other words, there's about a 50-50 chance that any given ancestor didn't give you any DNA at all. Again, they're your ancestors, but you have no genetic connection with them. And actually, the further you go back, the bigger the odds are that you get no DNA from a given ancestor whatsoever. You have to sort of bear that in mind when, you're getting these ancestry results. I mean, these are just rough averages of sort of the populations that your ancestors belong to, but it's only a small sampling of your ancestors that can be picked up by looking at your DNA, because your DNA only represents this very small sampling of your full ancestry.
And ancestry has become such a popular topic with I've mentioned the direct consumer tests. You say in your book that genealogy has now become the second most popular search term on the internet, outranked only by porn. Why do you think people are so interested in their ancestry and their genetic roots? Is it really that genutainment or entertainment aspect? Or is it really advantageous for people to have this information?
It's funny that genetic is second only to porn in these internet searches. But, when I learned that, I thought, there's an interesting connection there, because we're talking about reproduction, either looking to the past or potentially to the future. And I think that our ancestors mean a tremendous amount to us. Our ancestors really play a big part in how we define ourselves. I think that's always been true, but now we have sort of transferred a lot of these ways of thinking about ancestors just to our DNA, because we feel that somehow our ancestors are not just within us, but sitting on those DNA molecules somehow. And so it doesn't surprise me that these ancestry companies are doing incredibly well. The sales of these kits is just taking off at such an exponential pace. There have been, I think, over 20, maybe 25 million kits sold so far just in the past few years. And there have been some projections we might be looking at 100 million sales by 2020. And, I think that speaks to this profound desire to connect with our ancestors. And, I don't want to diminish that desire. I mean, it's very meaningful. It's not just entertainment. I think it's particularly meaningful for people who have not been able to look at any sort of clear paper trail to know who their ancestors are very far back. The African American community has embraced DNA testing in a big way, combining it with genealogical services online, because they didn't have much in the way of a paper trail to look at to do genealogical research. For their slave ancestors didn't write wills that you could look at. They were in wills. They were property. And so this is a way to sort of jump over that history of oppression and slavery to try to make those connections, even trying to go back to particular places in Africa where their ancestors come from. Again, I think that this is a profound, meaningful thing, and I just want to help people to understand what their DNA, as they see it in these tests, what it can and cannot tell them about their ancestry and also about themselves.
I think it's also important to mention that depending on your ethnicity and where your ancestry is, that you could be at elevated risk compared to the general population for different types of genetic disorders that you could be a carrier for. So that's, I guess, another piece to throw in there. Before we end the show, I did want to ask you opened the book up with going to a prenatal genetic counseling session with your wife, which you were a little apprehensive about. Can you share what you had expected from this genetic counseling session and how your impression may have changed in the years since?
So I have two daughters. They're now 17 and 14. And so this would have been in 2000 or early 2001 that I went with my wife to a genetics counselor. Our OBGYN had asked that we do it. And I just sort of thought like, well, there's not much point in this. I assumed that they just wanted to talk about Down syndrome. And, my wife and I had already talked about that. We sort of understood what our take was on it, but I didn't see what else there was for us to talk about. And again, like this is not at a point where like you can just go get your genome sequenced and find out exactly what sort of disease variants you have. So instead, this genetic counselor just did the good old family history and started asking me about my family, asking about, what sort of diseases had been in my family and so on. And I just was embarrassed and astonished that I really didn't have a very good grasp on that. And I thought, wait a minute, like my wife is pregnant and there's this person who's going to come into the world who will inherit a bunch of genes from me, and I have no idea what they might be and what I might be passing down. And it really got me very scared and upset. And I don't blame the counselor at all. It was just that the full impact of heredity hadn't really hit me until really that moment. Thankfully my daughter was just fine, and her sister is just fine, and I feel very fortunate in that regard. And it was interesting that 15, 16 years after that scary episode, I got my genome sequenced. My daughter was curious about it and actually went to Ancestry and got her genome, or at least her genotyped, and we're sort of looking at these results and looking at connections and so on, and now we can talk about these things down at the level of individual mutations. So it's kind of mind-blowing that the science has advanced so far from when I first became a father till now.
Yeah, it definitely captures just how much we're expanding, and even textbooks that are published, sometimes they're out of date within a very short period of time. It's exciting to see where things are going, and I definitely understand apprehension of there's just so much going on with genetics. Thank you so much for being on the show, and I want to ask you if you have any other projects in the works to share of what people can look forward to.
Well, I'm, continuing to write my column in the New York Times. It's called Matter. It comes out mostly once a week. And then I'll be looking for that next big book idea.
Great. Well, maybe we'll have you back on when you do another book.
That'd be great.
Well, thank you so much for coming on the show and sharing your insight with all of this. Again, the book we've been talking about is She Has Her Mother's Laugh. It is a fantastic book and really, really worth reading. So thank you so much, Carl Zimmer.
Thank you.
To learn more about Carl Zimmer, you can head over to his website at carlzimmer.com. You can also follow him on Twitter at Carl Zimmer and on Facebook at Carl Zimmer Author. I also wanted to give a shout out to Book Zebras, a book club for genetic counselors. Their book for April is Resurrection Lily by Amy Byer-Shaman, who, if you listened way back on episode 25 of the show, I interviewed. Learn more by following them on Twitter at Book Zebras. And as always, to access all the episodes and more, you can head over to dnapodcast.com. I'm on Twitter at DNA Podcast, Instagram at DNA Radio, and any of your questions, comments, concerns can be sent into info@dnapodcast.com. And again, I would really, really appreciate if you could rate and review on iTunes or whatever podcast player you listen to this show. And if you're on the radio, you can look me up on iTunes or Google Play. Before you go, I wanted to remind you about Keck Graduate Institute summer courses. KGI is an innovative grad school that is a member of the Claremont Colleges. Their name might sound familiar if you listen to the genetic counseling application episodes with Brenna, who is a genetic counseling grad student there, one of my friends. I receive a lot of emails from students, particularly those interested in genetic counseling, and it's always great to connect when I can and provide resources like these classes. The KGI courses are open to all undergraduates seeking careers in healthcare or life sciences. They have on-campus options in Claremont, California, as well as online courses. One of their online courses is actually in genetics, as I mentioned at the beginning of the show. It's an introductory course that will explore how the information in DNA contributes to disease, physical traits, and other inherited characteristics. It's a really great way to expose yourself to genetics, test out if you want to pursue a career in the field, refresh on some topics, prep for grad school, so many different reasons to expose yourself and take a course over the summer. Learn more and browse all of their courses by visiting kgi.edu/DNA today. Again, that's kgi.edu/DNA today. Thanks for listening, and join me next time to learn and discover new advances in the world of genetics.
The genes of you and me, the genes of you and me are all made of DNA. We're all made of the same chemical DNA.